Being a human and navigating life can be challenging at times. When you're navigating life on this healing journey, it can be even more difficult. There's a lot of times that we question, is this normal? Am I crazy? And that can get in the way, quite often, of how you're viewing yourself and what you allow yourself to experience. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. I want to talk a little bit about an example that came up that's very specific about being an introvert, but this really applies to a lot of areas, I think, in life. So I mentioned about like questioning things, and one of the things that happens quite often is that we will look at different things that we do, different behaviors, different tendencies, and question, is it normal? Am I crazy? Am I alone? What's wrong with me? And sometimes that comes from a belief of something being wrong with you. And sometimes it's just kind of this constant anxiety and comparison sort of thing. But oftentimes we can look at something as, well, it's just the way that it is, and learn to try to navigate around the challenge that that creates. And sometimes that is the reality of what we need to do. Sometimes we need to learn to just navigate through things. And sometimes there are things that we can do to actually create change so that we don't have to worry about trying to navigate around it. And that's kind of what I want to talk about more so today. A friend shared a video with me recently asking my thoughts about it because it was something she could kind of relate to. And the video was of a husband saying, this is what it's like living with an introvert or something along that line. And I'll show what that is, but the comments is really kind of the reason, or kind of the reason that I decided to do this video. But so the example that he gave is that his wife is such an introvert that she'll go into a store and for something in particular that I don't know if it was something she wants or needs or whatever, but she'll go in there specifically for that, but she can't find it. And she would rather leave than ask where it might be, ask an employee where it might be. And it's kind of played off as kind of this funny thing about being an introvert. And my thought was, that's not purely about being an introvert. And in the comments, so many people, I didn't read through all of them, there were a lot actually, but the ones that I did read were people kind of in agreement with that and giving their own examples that were somewhat similar in terms of like being fairly drastic in the implications of that. And so doing this video is because I know it's something that people can really relate to, whether it's about being a so-called introvert or something maybe totally unrelated, but where there's something that shows up for you in your life, maybe something that is a pattern of behavior or choices that you make or fears that you have or whatever, or even beliefs, purely just beliefs that you hold, that cause you to make a choice that potentially ends up being problematic for you in some way. Now, on the spectrum of problematic, there's pretty mild and then quite significant. So it could be anywhere on that spectrum. But being able to recognize that if there is something that is creating a challenge for you, especially if it's a pattern, creating any sort of difficulty for you, that is likely more than just a quirky personality trait. Because in that circumstance, whether it was something she wanted or needed, it was important enough that she went somewhere specifically to get the thing, but it felt so uncomfortable that instead of asking, she left without it. Now, if this is just a snack that she kind of craved and couldn't find it and left, that would be on the one end of the spectrum, right? Like, okay, not that big of a deal. And maybe it wasn't even something that, maybe it was something that would make her feel bad afterward physically or something. I don't know, like a candy bar or whatever. That would be on one end of the spectrum. But in all reality, that kind of thing can happen, even if it's something that you actually need, whether it's something that you need for your home or something that you need for your well-being, a grocery item, like it could be a lot of things, right? And if something as kind of simple, and I know it may not feel simple, but if something as simple as asking somebody, a store employee, where something might be, if that creates so much difficulty that you'd rather leave, then what does that mean for things that are more significant in your life? Things that you may really need to be able to ask somebody about or share with somebody. So being able to really think about, does this pattern that I have, does it create any sort of difficulty for me? Does it create a challenge? Does it cause me to not honor what I need or even want? Because honoring what you want is an important practice in healing, right? So even if it was a candy bar and maybe she wouldn't feel good after eating it, part of healing is being able to recognize what you want, thinking, oh, I'm really craving this particular candy bar. I'm going to go get it. And you make that effort, which I would say, if that's something that you have struggled with, this is part of your healing, right? So if you're making the effort to do that, you get there, you can't find it, and you feel embarrassed, you feel ashamed, you feel guilty for wanting the candy bar, whatever it is you might be feeling, or even maybe undeserving of taking up that person's time. If that part is kind of winning out over acknowledging and acting on what it is that you want, then that is going to reinforce that what you want doesn't matter. What you want isn't important. And that actually is quite significant, because it's not going to be one time, right? That is going to tend to happen time and again throughout your life. And so the impact of that is actually quite significant, even though it may seem the complete opposite, because it's reinforcing the pattern as well as the belief and or the fear. And so, like, in looking in some of these comments and some of the things that people were saying, there were different examples of how, and right now nothing else actually is even coming to mind in terms of a different type of example, because a lot of them were specifically about calling themselves an introvert. And I want to be clear, I believe in being an introvert, like that does exist. But I think suggesting that there's so much discomfort around asking an employee where something might be, like thinking that that is just simply being an introvert, it isn't. It really isn't. And if you think about how else does that show up, where else do you not feel comfortable speaking up or asking for something or sharing what you want, because there's a good chance that that is the case. And for so many people, being an introvert has a lot to do with the difficulty in being around people or conversing with people. because you feel intimidated, because you feel like you don't have anything to offer in the conversation, because of a number of reasons. And it's nuanced. It's different for different people, and it can even be different depending on the circumstance, and just depending on the circumstance and who that person might be. But if something is creating difficulty for you, then there's a good chance that there might be something that you can do so that you don't continue to have that difficulty. Because healing is about freedom, right? And other people might describe it differently, but for me, healing really is about freedom in living your life. Freedom from the burden of the false beliefs, from the burden of shame, from fear of how people will respond or what they'll think, the weight of the burden that you've been carrying, so much. Healing is the freedom of no longer having that weigh you down, to take up space in your mind, to create physiological responses, to be able to just be in any given moment from a place of ease. And if there are things in your life that are creating difficulty for you, and of course there's a million and one ways that something could be creating difficulty for you, right? Like different kinds of things could be creating difficulty. So I'm certainly not going to say with absolutely every single circumstance, but for a lot of things, if it's creating difficulty for you, there's likely some work to do around that. And I also just want to say that that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that the work that you're doing hasn't mattered. It doesn't mean that here's just yet one more thing that you need to try to fix about yourself. It's not at all about that, because there's a good chance that it's all likely part of the same thing. So that's a big piece of why that's not what I'm saying. But the other thing is that being a survivor of childhood trauma does impact people in so many different ways. And it can look a little bit different, or sometimes a lot different, depending on the circumstance or the person themselves. But it can show up in a lot of different ways in different types of circumstances. And being able to recognize how it might be showing up in different ways or in different circumstances gives you awareness to be able to bring the practice that you're doing into that type of situation. Right? So like I'm thinking as somebody who helps people heal, if somebody's talking to me about being an introvert and they just really need their downtime, like that's something that I am absolutely going to support. I'm going to, we're going to talk about how to make sure that they're balancing their time with and among people and taking care of themselves. We're going to talk about boundaries and recognizing it's okay to say no if you feel like you don't have the energy for it and those kinds of things. But if they never share with me that they will actually leave a store instead of asking somebody for it, then I'm not going to have that piece of awareness and be able to kind of help them understand how to practice that, or how to even practice it maybe in some other ways if they're still really uncomfortable with asking somebody. But being able to recognize that, okay, this is a circumstance in which it would bring a lot more ease to my life if I felt a sense of freedom in being able to ask somebody where that thing is. If that's something that seems like it would be beneficial to you, then that is something to work on. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a big, like another huge layer of trauma healing. So I think that's important to recognize as well. It's just about building awareness around the impact that it's having, and what are some sometimes relatively simple things that you might be able to do to help with that. So again, I know I talked really specifically about this example and being an introvert, but this can apply in a lot of different ways. Like maybe not setting a boundary, or asking for a raise or a day off or something like that. Like it really can show up in a lot of ways. So just something to think about, something to consider, and really just something to notice. What are things that I might have a pattern of, or might have a tendency toward, that I just kind of chalk up as that's just the way it is, or that's just part of my personality, that's creating difficulty for you. Not to add something else to your plate, but to acknowledge that this is something maybe that is actually contributing, right? Going back to that idea of reinforcing things that you already believe about yourself. And you may not even be aware that that is happening. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some examples maybe that you recognize in your own life? It doesn't have to be about being an introvert. It can be about anything. But is there something that you recognize that you kind of maybe just chalked up to something and thought that was never really going to be something you could do about it, or wasn't that big of a deal, especially relative to maybe some other things? But now maybe you're able to recognize, okay, yeah, that actually is something that can create some challenge for me. And again, that spectrum could be very mild challenge, or it could be a really big challenge. I'd love to hear. Share in the comments. Thanks so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.